environments and other components. And what does this mean? So basically, up until now, we have created very simple things in A-frame, but well, you saw that my examples they are all very simple, very basic, with few objects. So they don't actually look like a virtual environment, something where a human could somehow inhabit. So they're very sterile, with just one or two objects. And why is that? Because it's difficult to create a complete environment. It's a lot of work to create all the small objects that make up a complex environment. And that's where one particular component of A-frame can help. And that component is exactly called environments. And it basically allows us to very quickly generate something that looks a bit more complete in terms of objects, 3D objects surrounding the user. And this is, so this environments, it's called a component in A-frame. And it's one of those external components. So it's not something that comes with the core A-frame library. So because it is an external component, we need to explicitly load it in our scene. So we need to include an additional JavaScript file. And how is that done? Well, we already saw that in the head element of our HTML file, we include the script for A-frame. So this is the standard A-frame script. When we need to include additional components, external components that were programmed by third parties, so by people outside of the A-frame team, we just need to include another script. So we just usually we just copy and paste the script that the documentation for the component tells us. So it's really easy, just go to the documentation website, copy and paste. And we have to do this, we have to paste after the script for A-frame. Okay, so this is important. And after we do this, after we include a new JavaScript file, we have access to additional functionality in A-frame. So we may have access to new primitives, new elements that we can include, or we may have access to additional attributes, to new components that we can add to existing objects, to existing primitives in A-frame. So for the environment component, we just have to copy and paste this line of text, this script, and include it in the head of our HTML. And then how do we use this environment? Well, it can be used in more than one way. One way is just to include a generic entity. So an A entity, I already mentioned this briefly before, but again, an A entity is simply a generic thing in our scene that doesn't have any particular visual representation. It doesn't have any predefined geometry, but just represents an element in the scene. And later, with components, with attributes, we can fill in that entity with different things. We may assign it, for example, a specific geometry. In this case, we'll be simply assigning it a specific environment. And you'll see that the environment itself is actually made up of hundreds of visual objects. But we don't care about that. We don't need to care about that. So we will include a generic entity, and then we will use the environment attribute. So this is a custom attribute that is only available after we include the script for the environment component. We'll talk a bit about the value of this attribute in a moment, but for now let me just show you an example. So we will include as value for now of this environment attribute simply the words preset, colon, and then one name from this list. This is basically a list of predefined environments that the programmer, the creator of this component, defined. I'll show you a few ones. I'll just try, make one last try at least, glitch, see if it's running. No, it's not. So I'll show you my local code. So I'll open the example here. So I'll show you first the source code, which is basically what was already on that chapter. So in this scene, you see here, very simple scene with a box and the generic entity that includes the environment. And in this case, I'm using that preset goldmine. So again, this is just a number, a set of names that the creator of the component defined. So the goldmine generates this environment that you see. So it automatically adds a few random objects. So this 3D yellowish objects that you see, it adds a ground and it adds a few mountains far away from the user. And it also adds a sky with a certain color. If we change, instead of goldmine, for example, we can use another predefined word, which is actually, they are all listed here in the comment. For example, let's try Egypt. So now we have a different environment. And you see, again, this is my red box, which is not part of the environment of that component. And then you see the environment now has, again, the same elements. So it has a floor, it has a sky with a given color, in this case, a gradient of colors, and some pyramids. And again, you can try, later on, you can try different presets. So it basically gives us a very quick way of kind of populating our scene with random elements, but that give us a sense of being in a kind of in a concrete environment. Some of these are very abstract, some of them are very weird. We have, for example, Tron, which tries to mimic some of that environment from the movie Tron with the grid, something with a digital electronic look. And we have a number of them. One that I often use is the forest one, which is also a cool environment to have because we have some trees there. We have a light sky and the ground is greenish. So it's a nice environment that we can use for many different purposes. Okay, so basically a very easy to use component. Now, one of the things that it's important to note about this component and other components that we'll see further on is that instead, many of these components, so instead of defining additional attributes that we can use in our primitives. They simply define a single attribute like this one, environment, and then inside the attribute we configure all the parameters for that component. And we do that by using that property syntax that we talked about when we saw that very brief introduction to HTML. So basically we use that syntax where we separate property names from property values by a colon, and then we separate multiple properties with the semicolons. So for example, we can, if we see additional properties for this environment component, instead of using only the presets, we can customize different aspects of the component. For example, we can use the dressing property, which allows us to define what kind of objects it will put randomly throughout the environment. So the preset defines a specific dressing, but we can change that. For example, you can see this second example where we are using the preset for the gold mine, like the first one we are using, but then we can change the dressing for mushrooms. Instead of showing those vertical columns, we can change to a different object. In this case, mushrooms. So these objects are also predefined by the component. There's a list that we can use, which is actually here. Which are, some of them are specific objects that we can identify, like a mushroom. Other are just kind of generic abstract things, like a cylinder, pyramids. They could have multiple interpretations. So we can define the dressing. We can also define the dressing amount, how many of these objects should appear around us. We can change the color, and we can change the scale of these objects. So in this second example, we see all that, all those properties. So we have this preset for the gold mine, but then we're saying we want mushrooms. We want 200 of them around us, and we want them to be orange. And we are using a scale of 1. So this means a default scaling. So we can quickly change that. If we think that's too many mushrooms, we can change that, for example, to 10. And now we have fewer mushrooms around us. They are still distributed randomly through the environment. That's always like it works. But we control the number of them. And also, it's an important thing to notice, particularly for this component, which is that things are actually random. So if you reload the scene, you may see different objects positioned in different locations. So you should never try to associate your own objects with a specific, for example, a specific mushroom. We shouldn't try to place, for example, an object, an additional 3D object here on the mushroom, for example, because the mushroom, when I reload, may not be here. So we should, for this component particularly, we shouldn't try to do that. It's random. It's supposed to be random. So we can control, and notice here, this is the most important part, perhaps, and the one that causes many problems, and that's why I'm drawing your attention to this. So we really have to use this syntax. It's very important, and at least I make a number of mistakes here. So I often replace, instead of writing a column, I write an equal sign, because I'm used to writing equal signs for the attributes. I sometimes forget a semicolon and sometimes write a comma instead of a semicolon. So there are a number of small mistakes that we can do. Glitch identifies some of those, but others are impossible to identify. So you have to be a bit careful here. One of the things that you can try doing is formatting your code, like in this example. So hitting the return key, a new line for each property, so that each one is on a different line, making it a bit easier to read. I'll just go through a few different properties for the environment component that we can control. Not all of them. If you want to see all of the things that you can control, you really need to look at the documentation that is linked here at the top, the beginning of the section. I'll just show you the main things. So another important thing that we usually want to do with this environment component is to control what it calls the play area. The play area is basically an empty area centered at the position of the user. And so this allows us to define an empty area where the environments component doesn't put any arbitrary random object. So it's a clear and it's a flat area without any hills. And we can control this by using the play area property. Another thing to try to be aware is that properties, they are usually case sensitive. So you have to be careful and using the exact name that is documented. So in this case, play area, the A in area, the first A is capital A. So we need to be careful about that. So in this case, we are saying that we want a play area of 10. So we want a radius of 10 meters that is clear, so that we can position our own elements in that area without them conflicting with other random objects placed by the environments component. So for example, here in the third example, we have a play area of 10. And you see, actually, I'm going to change the example to make it easier to see the effect. So let's try including here addressing amount. Just make sure that, and changing the play area to 1. Let's see if this creates something that it's easier to see. Okay, so we see a lot of stuff, and eventually, if we move, we would hit one of those objects. And let's make this 100 really big. Just try to see if I can show the effects of the play area. Oh, actually here it's not very easy to see. Maybe I can try this one. I'll change that to the other preset. I think it's easier to see the effect of the play area. So let's change this to the one in the previous example, because I think it's a bit more crowded. It's probably easier to see. How the play area affects the environment. Okay, so I think this will be enough. So we see this mushroom very close to us, and let's try changing the play area. Okay, so it's easy now to see. Well, actually, no. Something went wrong here. These mushrooms shouldn't be here. I guess that's a bug in, maybe I'm doing something wrong here. Play area, maybe I made a mistake in the name of the property. Play area, no, think not. Okay, let me quickly confirm the documentation. So maybe I made a mistake in the name of the radius. Place inside, no. It's supposed to be that. Correct. Maybe there's a syntax area. Just make it a bit smaller. Or maybe this is just a bug of the environment. Yeah, this shouldn't be here because it's, I think, well, the distance is not easy to know, but it seems less than 5 meters. Well, anyway, components have bugs also, so maybe that's a good thing this happened here. These things always happen in live coding. I'll have to check this because in the tests that I made while preparing the examples, this seems to be working. So maybe I'm using a different version of the component. I'm not sure. I'll check anyway. The idea of display area parameter property is to create an empty area around us. So maybe I was just interpreting that environment incorrectly. Maybe it was farther away than I was thinking. But in any case, I'll try to check it. And as you saw, I'll open the documentation again for that environment component. This is a GitHub page. And if you scroll down, you see a number of parameters here that we can control. And in that chapter, I was just mentioning what I think are the most important ones. But there are lots of parameters that allows us to fine-tune the appearance of the environment. So particularly for your project, if you decide to use this environment, I would advise you to go through the list of properties here in this documentation and maybe just experiment with some of them or most of them and see the effect, because I think it's really possible to very quickly and without much effort or without creating a very large project in terms of file size, to create a very nice looking and complex, visually complex environment by tweaking all these properties. But so I won't be doing that here for you because it doesn't make much sense. You really need to tweak it, each parameter and see how it works, and it's very boring to see someone doing that. Another component, so I'd like to show you two additional components in this chapter that I think can be very useful. They're very simple, but I think they can be useful for creating complex looking environments. Another component is called a particle system. And a particle system, well, it's actually exactly that. So it's a system of particles, a set of particles. And particles are just kind of mathematical construct. They are simply, they have a position in 3D space, they have a velocity, they have an acceleration, so they are usually moving around. And often that's because for what they are used to, they have a visual representation. Particles don't really need to be 3D objects, and often they are not 3D objects. Often they are just 2D images very simple 2D images, or they are objects, but not three-dimensional. And sometimes they're just kind of a point. They just look like a point in 3D space. And usually a particle system has lots and lots of particles, and this is what creates the complex looking environment. To use this, I'll show you in a minute what it looks like. To use this component, we need to add an additional script. So again, it's an external component, and it's documented here, and you can see, you can just copy and paste this script. And very much like the environments component, we have a new attribute called exactly particle system. So usually the attribute has the name of the component. And like the previous one, there are also a few presets, which is good for us because it allows us to very quickly to set up something without having to tweak every single parameter. So I'll just show you this example for running with a particle system. So here you see that I'm using actually both components. So I'm using the environments one, and I'm using the particle system. And the particle system with a preset of rain. And you see, I'm not sure if you can see this correctly through the Zoom streaming, but you should be able to see some drops, what appears like drops of water coming down vertically from the top. So this is the particle system. There are always a number of particles that are living in the environment, and these particles, when they in this case they hit the ground, and eventually they disappear, and they are replaced by other particles. So the particle system is continually generating particles, and particles are continually dying out. And so this is also a very useful component, can be used for many other things. So it can be used to simulate rain, it could be used to simulate a fountain, it could be used to simulate fireworks, it could be used to simulate many things. It could be used to simulate smoke coming out of a car, for example. Many applications. One important thing to have in mind is that there is a slight incompatibility between the environments and the particle system. And so I usually, when I use both, I usually use this attribute in the environment. In the environment component, basically we need to disable what is called the fog in that environment. So the fog is something that makes objects appear as though as they are far away from us, they appear as they have there's some kind of fog or mist between us, and so the objects appear to be disappearing out on the distance. But when we try to use also the particle system, there's an incompatibility because of this parameter, so we need to disable the fog. We can also customize the particle system, and again, I'll just show you a few, very few customizations that we can do. So I usually use a preset, and you can see some of the presets in the documentation, and then I customize additional properties. So for example, you can customize the color of the particles. By default, a particle is just an image, a white image, with the shape of a drop. We can customize the color of that image. We can customize the size, so we can make it bigger or smaller. We can actually change the image also, but I don't think I have an example here for that. You'd have to change to check the documentation. So we can change color and size. We can also change the speed at which the particles are being emitted in the direction. So I'll show you this example, example number 7. So in this example, I'll format the text to be a bit easier to read. So here I'll do it manually. And actually in this example, I have an example of, it shows how to change the image. I forgot about this. So in this example, the particle system, we are changing the velocity of the particles, and the velocity is something that we have to define in 3D space also. So in this case, again, we apply the same rules. We are giving a velocity of 0 on the x-axis, 12 on the y, 0 on the z-axis. So the particles will shoot up in the air. We can also define the velocity spread, which is basically what allows the particle system to randomly choose a velocity. So instead of they always shooting up exactly vertically, it can change a little bit from one particle to the other. You can give it that spread. It's more natural looking than if all the particles were being shot up at exactly the same direction. We can actually change, so I had forgotten about this in my example. We can actually, so you can see here how to change the texture. The texture is the image that's being used for the particle. So we just use the texture property and give it the URL for a new picture. And we can change the color, as we already saw, and the opacity. So we can make it semi-transparent if we would like. And when we run this, so we see my colors are not that great, but what matters is that we have something that's shooting up in the air. So this could be a fountain, for example, if the colors were a bit more plausible. It could think of this as a water fountain. So it's very cool component, I think, to include in our environments. Of course, we have to be also a bit careful. Check the documentation. Check. It's possible to change the number of particles. You can have thousands of particles at the same time. But again, then we have to be a bit careful to make sure that our environment runs smoothly in the browser. So, because if we have thousands and thousands of particles, then it will be a bit more, it won't run as smoothly, or may not run as smoothly in the browser, because it will require more CPU to run. And the final component, very quick one, is the oceans component. This one is kind of basic. It's also an external component. It needs an additional script. It's kind of basic. It's not very complex visually. I'll show you the effect of using the ocean. But it's still with a bit of imagination. It's still very useful. I've seen some imaginative uses of oceans in different projects. So an ocean basically creates this that you see here. Something that looks like vaguely like the waves in the ocean. And we can change the speed, as you can see. So here I have various oceans. We can change the color, we can change the speed. We can see that in the last one, we can also change the height of the animation. And we can combine all this, so we can create like a very slow moving sea, or a body of water, or more rough water. And you see that we can also change the color, so we can change also the transparency, etc. But in essence, it's always a rectangular type of object. So in many situations, we have to somehow disguise the borders, because otherwise it may not look very natural. But that's easy to do. Just put other objects around the ocean in a way that they hide the borders of the ocean itself. So final example. So here's nothing new. Just wanted to show you a final example, just to show that it's possible to combine all of these components and create something. Well, this was done by me, so don't mind the colors, and um, so I'm not very good at arranging, making sure that the colors are nice looking, etc. So, but you see here all the components being used. So the environments, in this case, I think the Japan presets, and then I created like a box to hold the fountain. I didn't adjust it very well, so you see here that these walls should be a bit taller because you can still see the border of the ocean. Um, but you see also the ocean, so another component, and finally the particle system component, so simulating kind of a water fountain here. So it's possible to combine everything into kind of weird looking or interesting looking environments.